What's up, everybody? Today we're going to be doing standard input, standard output, and standard error. I didn't know if this deserved its own video, so I guess we'll see at the end of this. Standard input is read from the keyboard, and standard output or standard error is printed to the screen, typically. So in this picture right here, we can see standard input right here is from the keyboard, which goes to the command or process or program running or whatever. And there's standard output, which goes to your display. And there's also standard error, which also goes to your display. We'll go into detail for each of these, but it's good to know that when you launch a Linux command or process, 3 data streams are created, and it's these 3. It's a standard input, output, and error. And a data stream is a flow of data, which is often text that goes from one source to another. This source is the keyboard, this destination is the command. And these numbers on here, they're called file descriptors. So in Linux or Unix, everything's treated as a file, including directories. And each file has a unique identifier known as a file descriptor, which is a non-negative number starting at 0. So for standard input, its file descriptor is 0. For standard output, it's 1. For standard error, is 2. And this might not make a ton of sense, but we will use this in the next video when we do pipes and redirects. So when you run a program or command in the terminal, the shell automatically opens 3 files by default, each with a specific file descriptor and predefined role, which are standard input, output, and error. So with standard input, the file descriptor is 0, like we said, and typically this comes from your keyboard. So you type something on your keyboard, it shows up on the terminal, that's the standard input. Now, it doesn't have to come from your keyboard, which we'll see later, but typically it does. For standard output, this is the default output destination, so when you run a program that prints something to the screen, it typically is standard output just to the display, but you can have standard error. This is the same thing as standard output. It also just throws output to the display. However, it's made for error message in particular. So I wrote a little program to show each of these. So it's outputs.py, and we'll nano into it to see what we got. So in this, basically how this works is we first read input. So this is just having a user enter their name, and it checks if their name's a valid name or not. So it takes user input, which this is in Python, but input is standard input. This is in Python, and input is just a standard input. So enter your name, you type it on the keyboard, and that's your standard input. And there's an if-else right here. So it says if, and it checks for a digit in user input, so your name can have digits in it. That's the only check it's doing. It's not the best name verification program, but it'll work for our purposes. So it'll check, okay, this line is just saying, are there any digits in the name? And if there are, it's not a valid name, and it writes to standard error. So this says sys, we imported sys up here, which is what we need to write to standard error. It says sys.standarderror.write, and it is invalid input, you can have numbers in your name. Else, so if it didn't have any digits, that means in our case it's a valid name, we write to standard out. That's the default. So sys.standardout.write hello, whatever the name is. And this is just print. I wanted to do it this way to really show you what standard out is, but if you do print hello user whatever, that's the same thing as standard out. And let's run this. So we'll do python 3 outputs.py. So enter your name, standard input. We'll do an invalid name at first. So I'll do Ryan and then a bunch of numbers. So we can't do that. So this is standard error printed to our terminal, and it says invalid input. You can't have numbers in your name, because obviously we have numbers up here. And we'll run it one more time, and we'll enter a legit name, do Ryan. This is hello Ryan. So it looks the same, but this is the standard error. Prints to the screen, says you can't have numbers in your name. This is standard output because we didn't have any error, so we could print it to the screen. And then the standard input is this up here, or this right here. This is from our keyboard to the program.